Hold a book in your hands. Feel the weight of it, the texture of the cover, the slight resistance as you turn a page. Now imagine trying to explain this object to someone living 5,000 years ago. No paper, no ink, no binding, no shelves, just stone, clay, and memory. The book feels ordinary today, but it is one of the most powerful inventions in human history. It has survived empires, wars, technological revolutions, and cultural shifts. It has changed shape again and again, yet it has never disappeared. Tonight, we are going on a journey across thousands of years to uncover how books evolved from carved symbols pressed into clay to invisible digital files stored in clouds of data. Along the way, you will see how every transformation in the book changed the way humans think, communicate, and build civilizations. And as we move forward, ask yourself something important. If the format of knowledge keeps changing, what does that mean for the future of reading? But before we look ahead, we must return to a world where writing itself was brand new. Please like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment the next video topic in the comments. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine living 5,000 years ago. There are no notebooks, no archives, no libraries. If you want to preserve a story, you tell it again and again. If you want to track grain storage, you trust someone's word. If you want laws to remain consistent, you rely on elders to remember them accurately. This works in small communities. But something was happening in ancient Mesopotamia. Cities were forming. Agriculture was expanding. Trade networks were stretching across rivers and deserts. Suddenly, memory alone was not sufficient. When dozens of merchants are exchanging goods across long distances, trust needs reinforcement. When rulers collect taxes, records must be precise. When temples store offerings, accountability matters. Out of this pressure, one of humanity's greatest breakthroughs emerged. Writing. Around 3000 BCE, in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, people began pressing small wedge-shaped symbols into wet clay. At first, these marks were simple. They represented quantities of grain, livestock, trade goods. But over time, symbols evolved into a structured writing system. This system allowed people to record not just numbers, but language. And here is what makes this moment so powerful. For the first time in human history, thought could outlive the thinker. A clay tablet, once dried in the sun or hardened in fire, could survive centuries. Imagine holding a piece of baked earth that contains the voice of someone who lived thousands of years before you. Their transaction, their story, their law, still intact. But clay had limitations. It was heavy. It could crack. It was not ideal for long flowing narratives. So while Mesopotamia was pressing symbols into earth, another civilization along the Nile River was experimenting with something different. Papyrus. The papyrus plant grew abundantly along riverbanks. Strips from its inner stem were layered crosswise, pressed flat, and dried into thin sheets. For the first time, writing surfaces were flexible and lightweight. Sheets could be glued end to create scrolls that extended several meters. Now stories could flow continuously. Administrative records could stretch across long documents. Religious texts could be carried, stored, and transported. Papyrus changed mobility. Clay preserved information. Papyrus moved it. But scrolls introduced a new design challenge. Imagine trying to locate a specific line in a text that is 30 feet long. You must unroll it carefully, scanning section by section. There are no page numbers, no instant flipping, no random access. The structure of the scroll shaped how people thought. Information was linear, sequential. To reach the end, you had to pass through the beginning. And yet, despite its limitations, the scroll dominated for centuries. Libraries emerged. Collections formed. In Alexandria, a massive library attempted to gather scrolls from across the known world. The idea of collecting knowledge was taking shape, but the scroll had a hidden flaw. It was fragile at the edges. Repeated rolling and unrolling caused wear. Damage to one part could compromise large sections. As texts grew more complex, scholars began to desire something more durable, something easier to navigate, something that could handle expanding volumes of information. And in the Roman world, that quiet innovation finally appeared, not in a grand announcement, not in a dramatic revolution, but in a simple change of format. Stacked sheets. Folded. Sewn. Bound. The birth of the codex. and that small design shift would quietly alter the course of reading forever. In the next chapter, we will slow down and examine how flipping a page instead of unrolling a scroll transformed literacy, organization, and the psychology of information itself. Because sometimes, history does not change through explosions. Sometimes it changes when someone decides to turn the page instead of unrolling it. Imagine the first time someone folded a stack of written sheets in half and stitched them together. It did not look revolutionary. There was no cheering crowd, no dramatic unveiling, just pages, sewn along one side, protected between covers. But that simple shift changed how humans interact with knowledge forever. The codex did not arrive in a world that was waiting for it. It arrived in a world dominated by scrolls. Scrolls had ruled for centuries. They were familiar, established, trusted. So why change? Because as knowledge expanded, scrolls became inconvenient. Picture a scholar trying to compare two sections of a long text. With a scroll, you unroll part of it. Then you try to hold that position while locating another passage. It becomes awkward, physical, almost acrobatic. You cannot easily flip back and forth. You cannot quickly reference multiple sections at once. But with pages, everything changes. You open, you flip, you mark, you return. The codex allows non-linear reading. That might sound minor. It is not. Non-linear reading means you can jump. You can cross-reference. You can analyze instead of simply follow. The design of the book begins shaping the design of thought. In the first centuries of the Common Era, the Codex slowly gained popularity in the Roman world. At first, it may have been used for practical purposes. Notes, legal records, everyday writing. But gradually, more substantial works were copied into this format. Why? Because it was efficient. A codex could hold more text in less space, since both sides of each sheet could be written on. It was compact, easier to carry, more durable when reinforced with wooden boards and leather covers. And here is something fascinating. The physical boundaries of pages created new habits. Margins appeared. Readers could write notes beside text. Chapters became easier to define. Over time, pagination developed. The ability to number pages changed navigation forever. Now information could be indexed, referenced precisely, quoted accurately. You begin to see how something as simple as turning pages altered intellectual culture. Scrolls encourage sequential consumption. Codices encourage comparison and analysis. The codex made complex scholarship more manageable. Legal systems benefited. Religious communities benefited. Administrators benefited. And slowly, the scroll began to fade. By the 6th century, in many parts of Europe and the Mediterranean world, the codex had largely replaced it. But here is the deeper truth. The codex did more than change reading mechanics. It changed ownership. Scrolls often required careful storage and specialized handling. Codices, with protective covers, were sturdier. They could be transported more easily. They could be stacked on shelves. Yes, shelves. The rise of the codex contributed to the development of book storage as we recognize it today. Instead of scroll bins, books could stand upright. Spines became labeled. Collections became more organized. Libraries evolved physically because the book evolved physically. And as the format stabilized, something else intensified. The demand for copies. Because once a design works well, people want more of it. Scholars wanted texts. Religious leaders wanted scriptures. Governments wanted records. Students wanted instruction. But there was a bottleneck. Every codex still had to be copied by hand. If a community wanted 10 copies of a work, scribes had to rewrite it 10 times. Think about the labor involved. Every letter, every line, carefully reproduced. Human error was inevitable. Differences emerged between copies. A misplaced word here. A skipped line there. Texts were alive in a strange way because each copy carried subtle variations. And the labor was enormous. A large manuscript could take months to complete, sometimes years, which meant books remained valuable objects. Rare, costly, cherished. Imagine a time when a single volume might represent the work of multiple seasons. When pages were made from treated animal skins. When ink was mixed carefully from natural pigments. When mistakes had to be scraped away gently with a blade. The codex solved the navigation problem, but it did not solve the scale problem. Knowledge could now be organized beautifully, but it still could not multiply quickly. And as universities began to form in medieval Europe, as urban centers grew, as intellectual exchange increased, pressure began building beneath the surface. The codex had prepared the shape of the modern book. Now humanity needed a way to accelerate its reproduction. And that acceleration would not come quietly. It would arrive with metal, pressure, and mechanical precision. But before machines roared into action, there was a long, patient era of devotion. An era defined by ink-stained hands and candlelight. In the next chapter, we enter the world of medieval scribes. A world where copying a book was an act of endurance, discipline, and sometimes sacred duty. Because to understand the printing revolution, you must first understand what it replaced. Let us step into the silence of the scriptoria. Before machines multiplied words, human hands did. And they did it slowly. Step inside a medieval monastery just before dawn. The air is cold. Stone walls hold the night's chill. A narrow window lets in the faintest gray light. Somewhere in the building, a bell echoes softly. In a quiet chamber called the scriptorium, wooden desks are arranged near windows to capture every possible beam of daylight. Candles are precious. Parchment is expensive. Mistakes are costly. A scribe sits down. In front of him lies a stretched sheet of parchment made from animal skin. Calf, sheep, or goat. The skin has been soaked, scraped, stretched on a frame, and dried until smooth. It feels nothing like modern paper. It is thick, durable, slightly textured. Beside it rests a small knife for corrections. A quill cut from a feather. Ink made from soot or iron compounds mixed with water and binding agents. The work begins. Letter by letter. Line by line. No rushing. No shortcuts. If copying a long manuscript, the scribe may repeat this process for months. Sometimes longer. And here is something most people do not realize. These scribes were not simply copying text. They were preserving civilization. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe fragmented. Political stability weakened. Infrastructure declined in many regions. But inside monasteries, books survived. Religious texts were copied repeatedly to ensure continuity. Classical works were preserved because someone took the time to rewrite them. Without these scribes, entire bodies of knowledge might have disappeared. But the process was grueling. A single large manuscript could require the skins of dozens of animals. Ink had to be prepared carefully to prevent fading. Margins were ruled lightly before writing to maintain straight lines. Mistakes were corrected by scraping the parchment gently with a blade and rewriting the section. Illuminators sometimes added elaborate decoration. Gold leaf was applied in thin sheets. Pigments were derived from minerals and plants. Some manuscripts became masterpieces of visual art, with detailed illustrations woven around text. These books were rare and precious. They were often chained to desks in libraries to prevent theft. Ownership of books was a sign of wealth or institutional power. And because each copy required so much labor, access to knowledge was restricted. Imagine a world where most people never see a book, where literacy is limited, where information moves slowly across geography. In such a world, ideas spread at the speed of walking or horseback. A new interpretation of a text might take decades to reach another region. Errors could be introduced and replicated without standardization. And yet, despite the slowness, something important was happening. Universities began forming in medieval cities. Students gathered to study law, theology, medicine, philosophy. Demand for texts increased. Monasteries alone could not keep up. In some urban centers, professional scribes began operating outside monastic life. Book production became more commercial. But even with increased activity, hand copying remained a bottleneck. Think about it this way. If a university class had one copy of a required text, students might gather around it to listen while someone read aloud. Multiple identical copies were rare. The idea of thousands of identical books did not exist. Knowledge was fragile because it depended on repetition through handwriting. Now pause here and consider the pressure building. Cities are growing. Trade is expanding. Education is increasing. Intellectual curiosity is rising. But the speed of book production has barely changed. It is still bound by the limits of the human hand. This is the moment before acceleration. The moment when the old system strains under new demand. Somewhere in this environment, innovators begin experimenting with ways to reproduce text more efficiently. In East Asia, block printing had already shown that entire pages could be carved into wood and pressed onto paper. Movable type experiments had appeared in earlier forms. The concept of mechanical reproduction was not impossible. It was simply waiting for the right combination of materials, pressure, and economic motivation. And when that combination finally aligned in 15th century Europe, the effect was explosive. Because what happens when you take a world where books are rare and suddenly make them abundant? What happens when ideas can replicate faster than institutions can control them? What happens when knowledge escapes the slow rhythm of handwriting? In the next chapter, we enter the workshop of a metalworker who would help unleash one of the most powerful communication revolutions in human history. Ink will no longer depend on patience alone. It will depend on pressure. And once that pressure begins, the world will never read the same way again. Imagine a small workshop in 15th century Europe. It smells of metal, oil, ink, and wood shavings. Light filters through narrow windows. Tools line the walls. On a heavy table sits a device made of wood and iron, sturdy and deliberate in its design. This is not a weapon, not a musical instrument, not a farming tool. It is a machine that will multiply words. Until this moment, books have depended on human endurance. Every page required a scribe's steady hand. Every copy required time measured in months. Now something radical is about to happen. Movable metal type. The idea is simple in concept, but revolutionary in execution. Instead of carving an entire page into a block of wood, individual letters are cast in metal. Each tiny piece carries a single character in reverse relief. These letters can be arranged side by side into words, words into lines, lines into pages. Once assembled into a frame, ink is applied evenly across the raised surfaces. A sheet of paper is pressed firmly against the ink type using a mechanical press. The result is a clean impression of the page. Then the letters can be disassembled, rearranged, and reused for the next page. Think about what this means. A single set of metal letters can generate hundreds of identical copies. The bottleneck of handwriting is shattered. What once took a year can now be replicated in a fraction of the time. And perhaps even more important, copies become standardized. In the era of scribes, each manuscript was slightly different. Errors crept in. Spellings varied. Entire lines could be skipped accidentally. With mechanical printing, duplication becomes precise. The same words appear again and again with consistency. This consistency changes trust. Readers begin to assume that if two books are printed from the same type, they are identical. The concept of an edition begins to form. But the impact goes beyond efficiency. Printing lowers cost. When production speeds up, price drops. When price drops, access expands. When access expands, literacy rises. Imagine a town where only clergy and elites could previously afford books. Now merchants, craftsmen, and students begin acquiring them. Books move from monasteries into marketplaces. Printing workshops appear in city after city. Knowledge begins to circulate at a pace that feels almost unsettling to established authorities. Ideas that once traveled slowly now leap across borders. Scientific observations can be shared and debated more rapidly. Political arguments can reach larger audiences. Religious interpretations can spread beyond local control. The book becomes more than an object. It becomes a force, and forces reshape societies. Consider how different this feels from the scriptorium. In the monastery, copying was quiet and meditative. In the printing workshop, it is mechanical and rhythmic. The press creaks. Ink is rolled. Paper is stacked. Sheets dry on racks. There is noise, motion, production. Books are no longer singular treasures. They are products of a system, and systems scale. But let us slow down here. This was not an overnight transformation. Early printed books still resembled manuscripts in design. They used familiar fonts and layouts to make the transition comfortable for readers. Illuminators sometimes added hand-drawn decorations even to printed pages. The old world and the new overlapped. Yet beneath that overlap, momentum was building. The speed of information transfer increased dramatically. Printing houses competed. Publishers emerged. Authors began to think about audience size differently. The idea of mass readership was born. And here is the deeper shift. When books were scarce, knowledge was concentrated. When books multiplied, knowledge decentralized. Power structures adjusted. Education systems expanded. The expectation of access began to grow. The printing press did not create curiosity. Humans were already curious. Humans were already curious. It removed friction from curiosity. And once friction drops, change accelerates. But as transformative as early printing was, it was still labor-intensive. Pages were printed manually. Presses required skilled operators. Distribution relied on physical transport. The true explosion of scale would arrive centuries later, when steam power and industrial manufacturing entered the scene. Because if the printing press multiplied words, industrialization would flood the world with them. In the next chapter, we will step into a louder era, an era of factories, railroads, urbanization, and mass education. An era when books stopped being rare commodities and became everyday companions. The machine has begun to speak. Now industry will teach it to shout. The workshop was powerful, but the factory was unstoppable. Fast forward a few centuries. Cities are louder now. Smoke rises from chimneys. Railroads stretch across landscapes. Machines move with relentless rhythm. The Industrial Revolution does not just change transportation and manufacturing. It changes reading. Earlier printing presses multiplied books, but production was still limited by manual effort. Each sheet had to be pressed individually. Distribution was slower. Paper was expensive. Now imagine steam-powered presses that can print thousands of sheets in a single day. Rolls of paper fed continuously into machines. Metal cylinders spinning. Ink applied in rapid motion. The pace is no longer human. It is mechanical. Paper production also transforms. Instead of relying mainly on linen rags, manufacturers begin producing paper from wood pulp. This lowers costs dramatically. Cheaper paper means cheaper books. Cheaper books mean larger audiences. And here is where something subtle but profound happens. Reading begins to shift from privilege to habit. As literacy campaigns spread and public education expands, more people learn to read at younger ages. Governments recognize that literacy strengthens economies and administration. Factories need workers who can follow written instructions. Cities need citizens who can interpret information. Families begin keeping books in their homes. Libraries open their doors to the public. Books move off chained desks and into personal shelves. But another transformation quietly changes culture even further. The paperback. Hardcover books are durable but costly. Paperbacks are lighter, smaller, cheaper. They fit in bags, in coat pockets, on train seats. They travel. Now imagine a commuter in the 19th century sitting in a rail car with a small book in hand. This is new. Reading becomes portable in a new way. Not just portable in theory, but accessible in price. Mass production creates genres for broad audiences. Stories, practical manuals, educational materials, entertainment. Print runs increase from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands. Publishers begin thinking about markets. Advertising grows. Bookstores become fixtures in urban life. And the speed of distribution accelerates. Railroads move printed material across vast distances. Postal systems expand. Newspapers circulate daily. Magazines appear weekly or monthly. Information cycles shorten dramatically. The world feels more connected. And here is another shift to notice. Authorship changes. When books were rare and expensive, authors often wrote for narrow circles. Now they can imagine reaching strangers across cities and countries. The relationship between writer and reader expands. But mass production brings tension too. When printing becomes industrial, content can spread rapidly, both beneficial and controversial. Ideas compete in crowded marketplaces. Publishers must decide what to print and what not to print. Readers must choose among abundance rather than scarcity. Abundance creates noise. Noise requires discernment. For the first time in history, many people face not the problem of having too few books, but of choosing among many. Pause for a moment and imagine how radical this shift is. For thousands of years, books were scarce and expensive objects tied to institutions. Now they are personal companions. A worker might own a small shelf. A child might grow up surrounded by affordable reading materials. Knowledge moves not only vertically through authority, but horizontally through society. And as the 20th century unfolds, new technologies continue shaping how books are produced. Typewriters speed up manuscript preparation. Offset printing refines mass production. Global publishing networks form. International book fairs emerge. But beneath all this growth, another transformation is quietly preparing. Computers. At first, they seem unrelated to books. Massive machines filling rooms, calculating numbers, processing data. But over time, digital text emerges. Word processors replace typewriters. Files replace stacks of paper drafts. Then the internet connects computers globally. Suddenly, text does not have to be printed to exist. It can be transmitted electronically. And once again, friction drops. Remember that pattern. Clay tablets reduced memory loss. Papyrus increased portability. Codices improved navigation. Printing multiplied copies. Industrialization lowered cost. Each step reduces friction between thought and reader. So what happens when distribution becomes nearly instantaneous? When a book no longer requires paper at all. When entire libraries can fit into a device smaller than a notebook. In the next chapter, we step into the digital era. An era where the page becomes a screen. Where the shelf becomes a cloud. Where the meaning of ownership, authorship, and even reading itself begins to shift again. Because the story of books is not slowing down. It is accelerating. And the next leap may be the most dramatic of all. For thousands of years, books had weight. They occupied space. They gathered dust. They bent and aged and carried the scent of paper and ink. Then something happened that no scribe, no monk, no early printer could have imagined. The page dissolved. Not physically at first. Physically, books were still everywhere. Libraries expanded. Bookstores thrived. Paperbacks filled airport kiosks and bedside tables. But behind the scenes, something radical was forming. Text was becoming digital. In the late 20th century, computers moved from research labs into homes and offices. Word processing replaced typewriters. Editing became faster. Revisions no longer required retyping entire pages. Authors could rearrange paragraphs with a few keystrokes. Publishers could store manuscripts electronically. Files could be duplicated perfectly without degradation. Then the internet connected those files across the globe. And this is where the shift accelerates. Before the internet, even industrial printing required physical production and transportation. Trucks, ships, warehouses. Now a digital file could travel from one continent to another in seconds. No paper, no ink, no shipping costs, just data. At first, reading on screens felt uncomfortable to many people. Early monitors were bulky. Resolution was limited. Eyes strained. But technology evolved. Portable devices became smaller and lighter. Dedicated e-readers were designed to mimic the look of ink on paper using specialized displays. Tablets combined reading with browsing, communication, and media. Smartphones placed entire libraries into pockets. Imagine holding a device thinner than a single medieval manuscript page, yet capable of storing thousands of books. Think about that contrast. What once required rooms now fits in your hand. What once required animal skins and months of labor now requires a download. But digital books did more than change storage. They changed behavior. Readers could adjust font size instantly, search within a text for specific words, highlight passages without permanently marking a page, carry entire collections while traveling. Self-publishing expanded dramatically. Writers no longer needed traditional printing infrastructure to reach audiences. A manuscript could be uploaded and distributed globally. Barriers lowered again. Remember the pattern. Each major shift in book history reduces friction. Digital distribution nearly eliminates it. But frictionless systems create new questions. What does ownership mean when a book is a licensed file rather than a physical object? What happens to bookstores when readers download directly? How do authors stand out in a marketplace where publishing is open to millions? Abundance grows again, but now at an unprecedented scale. Discoverability becomes as important as production. Curation becomes valuable. Algorithms influence visibility. Reading itself adapts. Some people read in short bursts between notifications. Others use audiobooks to turn commutes into listening sessions. Text merges with multimedia. Interactive books incorporate hyperlinks and embedded content. The definition of a book expands. And yet, something surprising happens. Print does not disappear. Despite predictions that digital formats would fully replace paper, physical books remain resilient. Many readers still value the tactile experience, the ability to flip pages physically, the sense of spatial memory within a bound volume, the permanence of ink on paper. Instead of total replacement, we see coexistence. Paper and pixels share space. And here is the deeper insight. The history of books is not a straight line of replacement. It is a pattern of layering. Clay tablets did not vanish instantly when papyrus appeared. Scrolls coexisted with codices. Manuscripts continued even after printing began. Printed books thrive alongside digital ones. New forms rarely erase old ones immediately. They expand the ecosystem. So where does that leave us now? We live in an era where nearly anyone with internet access can publish words that reach the world. Information spreads at a speed that would have seemed supernatural to earlier centuries. But speed comes with responsibility. When copying required months of labor, content was scarce and curated by necessity. When publishing requires only a click, volume increases dramatically. Readers must navigate abundance thoughtfully. Authors must compete for attention. Technology will continue evolving. Artificial intelligence can now assist in writing and translation. Augmented reality may merge physical and digital reading experiences. Voice interfaces may shift more reading into listening. The medium will keep transforming, but the core purpose remains remarkably consistent. Books exist to preserve and transmit ideas across time. From clay impressions pressed by ancient hands to photons lighting up a screen, the goal has always been connection. One mind reaching another. Across distance. Across generations. Across civilizations. And here is the question that brings everything together. If books have continually adapted to reduce friction between thought and reader, what is the next barrier to fall? Will future generations look at our devices the way we look at scrolls? Will the concept of a book expand into forms we can barely imagine? The history of books is not just about materials. It is about momentum. A momentum that began when humans decided their thoughts were worth preserving. And that momentum has never stopped. So the next time you hold a book or swipe a screen, pause for a moment. You are participating in a story that stretches back 5,000 years. From papyrus to pixels. From silence to global conversation. And the next chapter is still being written. What role will you play in it? From clay pressed by ancient hands to glowing screens lighting up the night. The story of books is the story of us. Every era changed the shape of the book, but each transformation also changed the shape of the human mind. Writing freed memory. The codex reshaped navigation. Printing multiplied voices. Industrialization made reading ordinary. Digital technology dissolved distance. Through it all, one instinct remained constant. The need to preserve thought beyond a single lifetime. Books are not just objects made of paper or pixels. They are time machines. They allow us to think with people who lived centuries ago and to speak to people we will never meet. They are civilization's long memory and its loudest amplifier. And now the question turns to us. In a world where knowledge can travel instantly and information is limitless, how will we use this power? Will we read deeply or skim endlessly? Will we preserve wisdom or drown in noise? Will we create works that last or simply consume what flashes before us? The next chapter in the history of books is not waiting in a workshop or a factory. It is being written in real time by readers and writers everywhere. So when you open your next book or unlock your next screen, pause for a second. You are holding thousands of years of human effort in your hands. What will you do with it? Don't forget to subscribe on your way out. See you next video.